The invitation had arrived in a plain white envelope with no handwritten note, just Talia's name printed in elegant gold script above the venue address. Caleb Reddick had stood in his kitchen for 3 full minutes staring at it before setting it on the counter and going back to work. Now he sat at the last table in a ballroom that smelled like money, fresh flowers, expensive cologne, catered food that no one at his table had touched. Around him, strangers made polite conversation while stealing glances at the man in the pressed old suit who had no business being here. Across the room, Talia laughed at something her new husband said, her white dress catching every light in the chandelier above them. Then Preston Malloy leaned into the microphone and smiled. "I want to thank the man who came before me," Preston said, his voice smooth and carrying, "because he taught Talia exactly what kind of man she deserved." The laughter was soft, polished, cruel. Caleb set down his glass. He was done. Then a woman he had never expected to see here pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. "Pretend I'm your wife," she said quietly, "just for tonight." If you've ever sat at the last table and refused to disappear, this story is for you. Stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Caleb Reddick was not the kind of man who talked about pain. He had learned that early, not from his father, who had left before Caleb was old enough to remember his face, but from the years that followed. From the way the world responded when a black man from the south side of Atlanta showed too much of what was underneath. Too much hurt, and people called you weak. Too much anger, and they called you dangerous. So Caleb had learned to keep his face still and his voice level, and to let his work speak instead of his mouth. For 11 years, he had managed the night operations at Hartwell Distribution, the unglamorous, invisible kind of work that kept supply chains moving while everyone else slept. He tracked shipments, resolved loading errors, managed a floor crew of 30 men and women who trusted him because he never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself. He wasn't rich, he wasn't connected, but he was the kind of man who showed up every single night and did what he said he would do. That counted for something. He had always believed that. After Talia left, that belief was the thing he held on to tightest. She had walked out 6 years ago in the middle of a February that felt colder than any winter Caleb could remember. Their daughter Maya had just turned 12. Talia had packed 2 suitcases and said without looking at him directly that she needed a life that was going somewhere. That she was tired of waiting for something that was never going to come. Caleb had stood in the hallway of their small rental house and watched her go, and he had not begged, because begging felt like another form of lying. If she wanted to leave, he wasn't going to pretend she didn't mean it. What followed were the years that shaped him. He worked nights, slept in pieces, drove Maya to school, attended every parent-teacher conference, helped her with college applications at the kitchen table under a flickering overhead light he kept meaning to fix. When Maya got her scholarship and moved to a university 3 states away, Caleb celebrated alone with a bottle of decent bourbon and a phone call that lasted 2 hours. She was his greatest accomplishment, and she had not cost him his dignity to raise her only his time, his energy, and whatever softness he might have had left after Talia took it with her on the way out. She hadn't bought this hotel to prove a point, or at least that wasn't the only reason. She'd bought it because it was her mother's building more than it had ever been anyone else's, because Odessa had given 2 decades of her life to keeping it running, and because when Ariel finally had enough to do something real with her money, she wanted that something to mean more than a return on investment. She wanted to change what the door did. But first, she needed a room. Talia Brenner had grown up believing that presentation was everything. It was the one lesson her mother had drilled into her from the time she was old enough to sit still at a dinner table, that the right room, the right dress, the right man standing beside you could rewrite whatever story people thought they knew about you. She had spent the early years of her marriage to Caleb trying to reconcile that lesson with the reality of who he was, a man who worked nights, drove a truck with a cracked dashboard, and genuinely believed that character outlasted circumstance. She had stopped believing that before she left. By the time she found Preston Malloy at a real estate networking event 3 years after the divorce, she had decided she was done waiting for slow and steady to win anything. Preston was the opposite of Caleb in every visible way. He talked fast, dressed sharp, moved through rooms like he owned them. He had a development company, an investment portfolio, and a story about himself that sounded polished enough to be true. He proposed after 14 months. Talia said yes in a restaurant where the cheapest item on the menu cost more than Caleb's weekly groceries. The wedding had been planned for 6 months. No detail was too small. The venue was a lakeside hotel 40 minutes outside Atlanta, the kind of place that required a valet just to reach the front entrance. Every table had custom centerpieces. The champagne was French. The guest list ran to 200 names, most of whom Preston had assembled for business reasons and called friends for the occasion. The invitation to Caleb had been Talia's idea. She had told herself it was the gracious thing to do. She had told Preston it was about closure. What she hadn't admitted even to herself was that there was a part of her that wanted Caleb to see, to understand in a room full of everything she had built without him, that she hadn't been wrong to go. Caleb understood all of this. He understood it clearly enough to almost stay home. But he had come anyway because the alternative was letting Preston Malloy believe that Caleb Reddick was afraid to walk into a room. He had arrived on time, which turned out to be a mistake. On time meant he was seated before the room filled, which meant everyone who came after had a chance to notice him and decide what to make of him. He watched the recognition move across faces like a slow current. The relatives who had known him during the marriage. The old friends of Talia who smiled at him with too much softness. The colleagues of Preston who looked at him the way people look at something they can't immediately categorize. The seating assignment put him at table 14, the last table, near the service entrance. He sat down, ordered water, and made peace with it. He was used to the last table. He was used to being the person people looked past to get to someone more useful. It had never killed him before. It wasn't going to kill him tonight. Then the reception program began and Preston walked to the microphone. The first 10 minutes of the speech were unremarkable gratitude sentiment, a joke about cold feet that earned a rehearsed laugh from the crowd. Preston was good at this. He had the cadence of a man who had given many speeches in many rooms and understood that confidence is most convincing when delivered at a moderate pace. Caleb watched him and felt nothing in particular. Talia stood at Preston's side in her white gown, her hand resting in the crook of his arm, her smile steady and practiced. Then Preston's gaze drifted toward the back of the room. I also want to acknowledge someone who made tonight possible in a way he probably doesn't realize. Preston smiled. The crowd shifted, curious. They say every great love story needs a lesson learned first. So I want to thank the man sitting at table 14 because he taught Talia exactly what kind of man she deserved. The laughter came soft and immediate, polished, the kind of laughter that knows it is cruelty dressed in the clothes of a joke and doesn't care. Caleb didn't move. He set his glass down with careful deliberateness and looked at the table in front of him, and he thought about his daughter and the dry cleaning receipt folded in his jacket pocket and the 11 years of night shifts. And he decided he was done. Not angry done, not broken done, just finished with being in this room which had never been built for him in the first place. He pushed back his chair. "Don't stand up yet." The voice came from beside him, low and direct. He turned. The woman who had sat down next to him was not someone he had noticed arriving. She was in her mid-30s, composed in a way that seemed structural rather than performative, like composure was not something she worked at, but something she had decided on and stuck to. Her dress was dark green, her posture unhurried. She looked at him with the even, assessing expression of someone who measured rooms the same way he measured loading docks, practically without sentiment. He recognized her a half-second before she spoke again. Sloan Fairchild, CEO of Fairchild Logistics. He had seen her once 8 months ago during a third-party audit at Hartwell. She had walked the floor with 2 analysts and a legal representative, and Caleb had been the one to flag a discrepancy in the outbound manifest that her team had missed. She hadn't thanked him in the moment. She had just looked at him for 3 seconds longer than necessary, like she was filing something away. "Pretend I'm your wife," she said quietly. "Just for tonight." Caleb looked at her steadily. "You want to tell me why?" "Because a man like you shouldn't leave this room looking like he's been beaten." She glanced toward the stage without expression. And because I have my own reasons for not wanting Preston Malloy to feel comfortable tonight." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He understood immediately that this was a transaction that Sloane Fairchild did not make impulsive offers in public spaces. Whatever she was proposing had a cost, and a logic that she had already calculated. She was not doing this out of pity. That was the one thing that made him consider it. He also understood the risk. He had spent a career refusing to become someone else's instrument. He did not play roles. He did not pretend. The version of himself he had preserved through the divorce, through the years of working alone, through every moment when it would have been easier to perform a version of bitterness or defeat. That version was the only thing he had left that was entirely his. If he stood up with Sloane Fairchild, he was stepping into her story, not his own. But if he walked out, Preston won. Not because Preston deserved to, but because the room would see Caleb go and remember only that he had left quietly, and they would call it losing. He looked around the room, at the faces turned away just slowly enough to pretend they weren't watching. At Talia standing on the stage in her white dress, not looking at him at all. He thought about the iron, the 3 passes over the lapels that morning, the way he had done it carefully, not because anyone would notice, but because he had decided that he was worth the effort. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and held out his hand. "If you've already started the play," he said, "you'd better be ready to see it through to the end." Sloane looked at his hand. Then she took it, rose from her chair, and walked with him toward the center of the room. The shift in the room was immediate. It moved the way pressure moves, not with noise, but with a change in the quality of the air. Conversations didn't stop, they redirected. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Heads turned with the careful casualness of people who wanted to watch without appearing to watch. Because the woman walking through the center of the ballroom with her hand in Caleb Reddick's arm was not someone this crowd could afford to ignore. Sloane Fairchild had been invited to this wedding the way most powerful people are invited to events that require their money, with flattery dressed as friendship. Preston Malloy had spent 4 months cultivating a relationship with Fairchild Logistics, positioning his development company as a high-return partner for infrastructure investment. He had managed 2 dinners, 1 golf outing, and a carefully worded proposal that promised 22% returns over 3 years. He hadn't secured a yes yet. Tonight was supposed to be the room where that happened, where atmosphere and occasion did the work that spreadsheets couldn't. He had not factored in Sloane Fairchild walking to table 14. Preston's expression didn't break, he was too practiced for that, but something behind his eyes shifted. His smile tightened at the corners. Talia's hand resting on his arm went slightly still. Caleb felt all of it without looking directly at any of it. He had spent 11 years reading a room the way a floor manager has to peripherally constantly without making it obvious. He knew where every set of eyes had landed. He kept his posture easy and his pace unhurried, and he let Sloane set the direction. She led them to a table near the center of the room, where 2 of her associates were seated. She introduced Caleb without ceremony, as though his presence beside her was something that required no explanation. He shook hands, exchanged names, said something brief and appropriate. He had done harder things in harder rooms. Preston regrouped faster than Caleb expected. Within 20 minutes, he had moved through the crowd to where Caleb and Sloane stood near the edge of the dance floor, a fresh drink in his hand and his smile fully reconstructed. He brought 2 other men with him, associates by their posture, the kind who stood slightly behind and laughed at the right moments. "Sloane," Preston extended his hand to her first. "I didn't realize you 2 knew each other. There's quite a bit you don't realize about the people in your own supply chain," Sloane said pleasantly. She accepted the handshake without warmth. "That's something we should probably discuss before any investment decisions are made." Preston's smile held. He turned to Caleb. "Caleb, glad you could make it. I meant what I said up there, no offense intended, just a little humor." "None taken," Caleb said. His voice was level. "Humor lands differently depending on where you're standing in the room." Preston looked at him for a moment, assessing, recalibrating. Then he laughed, short and performative. "Fair enough." He looked at Sloane. "I wasn't aware you had any connection to the Hartwell operation." I maintain connections across the entire regional network, Sloan said. That's what due diligence looks like when it's done properly. The implication was quiet and precise. Preston heard it. One of the men behind him shifted his weight. We'll have to set up a proper meeting, Preston said. Get into the details. We will, Sloan agreed. When I'm ready. Preston held the smile for another beat, then excused himself with practiced ease. Caleb watched him go, tracking the way he moved directly toward a man seated alone at a table near the far wall, a thin man in a gray suit who had been watching their exchange from across the room. Caleb filed that away. Talia found him alone near the bar 20 minutes later, while Sloan was speaking with her associates. She looked the way she always looked when she was trying to appear indifferent, shoulders back, chin level, eyes doing the work of someone who had rehearsed the conversation in advance. She had been beautiful when Caleb married her, and she was beautiful now in a way that had always made him sad rather than proud, because beauty like hers had never been for him. It had always been aimed at the room. You didn't have to come, she said. You sent me an invitation. That doesn't mean I expected you to actually show up. Caleb looked at her steadily. Then it was a strange thing to send. Talia's jaw tightened slightly. Who is she? You know who she is. I know who she is professionally. I'm asking how you know her. We've crossed paths through work. He picked up his glass. Is there something you needed to say to me, Talia? Because if this is about her, I don't think tonight is the night for that conversation. Something moved across Talia's face, not guilt exactly, but the shadow of something adjacent to it. She looked at him the way people look at a version of themselves they've decided not to think about. Then she straightened and looked away. Preston is a good man, she said, like she was answering a question he hadn't asked. Caleb didn't respond. He took a sip of his drink and looked out across the ballroom, and he thought that there were easier things to argue with than a woman who was still trying to convince herself. She left without saying anything else. The dancing began at 9. Sloan appeared at Caleb's side as the floor opened, moving with the same unhurried deliberateness that seemed to characterize everything she did. She looked at the floor, then at him. I think this is expected, she said. Probably. They walked to the floor together. It wasn't the first time Caleb had danced at an event he didn't want to be at, and he moved with enough ease that no one watching would have guessed otherwise. Sloan was a precise dancer, controlled, attentive to spacing, not showy. They moved together without difficulty. After a moment, she said quietly, You can stop after this song. You've done more than enough. Caleb looked at her. Is that what you want? She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, I want to tell you something, and I'd rather do it here than at a table where people can read lips. He kept moving, kept his expression easy for the room. Then tell me. I didn't come to this wedding for Preston's benefit, she said. I came because I've been watching his investment proposal for 3 months, and something in the numbers doesn't fit. His projected logistics volume for the Southern Warehouse Corridor doesn't match the operational capacity any functioning facility in that region could realistically produce. She paused. You ran the Southern operations for Hartwell for 4 years. You know what those numbers should look like. Caleb was quiet for 3 beats. You think he's inflating the figures? I think someone is inflating the figures on his behalf, and he's either doing it intentionally or he doesn't understand his own business well enough to know it's happening. Either way, I can't move forward with an investment based on documentation I can't verify. She looked at him directly. You flagged a manifest discrepancy during our audit at Hartwell last year. You were the only person on that floor who did, and you remember that. I remember everything that protects my company. Caleb looked past her shoulder at the room, at Preston standing near the bar speaking to the thin man in the gray suit again. At the easy way Preston held himself like a man who had never had to account for any of it yet. What do you need from me? Caleb asked. Nothing tonight. I need you to think about whether you're willing to help me understand what the Southern Corridor numbers should actually look like based on what you know from running it. And if I say no, then you say no and this dance ends and we go our separate ways. She said it without pressure. I'm not offering you a trade, Caleb. I'm asking if you're willing to help me do something that matters. The song ended. Caleb stepped back and held her gaze for a moment. "Let me think about it," he said. She nodded once. "That's fair."
He was thinking about it when Preston cornered him near the exit hallway 40 minutes later.
The two associates were not with him this time. It was just Preston and the easy menace of a man who had decided the pleasantries were finished. He stood close enough to make the proximity deliberate without making it a confrontation. "Whatever she told you," Preston said, his voice low and pleasant. "I want you to understand something. Sloane Fairchild is a very smart woman who occasionally makes very emotional decisions when she's operating outside her lane. This wedding isn't her lane." Caleb looked at him. "I don't think she sees lanes the same way you do. She's using you." Preston's smile didn't change. "I don't know what story she gave you, but she brought her due diligence problems into a social event and put them on your shoulders. That's not care, Caleb. That's convenience. You spent half the evening putting me on a stage and using me as a punchline," Caleb said. "I'll take convenience over that." Preston's expression shifted. The smile thinned. "You've always had a problem with reality," he said. "Talia saw that. It's why she left. Some men just can't accept that the world isn't built to reward stubbornness." Caleb let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "What world are you talking about? Because the one I've been working in rewards the people who don't falsify shipping records." It was a test. He said it plainly, watching. Preston went very still. Just for a second, the kind of stillness that isn't calm, but is the thing right before calm breaks. Then he recovered. The smile came back. "I don't know what she told you," he said, "but I'd be very careful about repeating things you can't prove." He walked away. Caleb stood in the hallway and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he took out his phone and sent Sloane a single text message. "I'm in, but I want everything above board. Nothing that doesn't hold up." The reply came in under 30 seconds. "That's the only way I work." 3 days after the wedding, Sloane's office called to arrange a working meeting. It was professional, structured, and nothing like the evening that had preceded it. Caleb came in with 11 years of operational notes organized in a folder, not because she had asked him to, but because that was how he worked. They went through the Southern Corridor data together. Sloane's analysts pulled Preston's projections. Caleb walked them through what realistic throughput looked like at each facility based on staffing levels, dock capacity, and seasonal load patterns. The gaps appeared quickly. Preston's numbers weren't just optimistic. They described a level of operational activity that would require 3 times the documented workforce and twice the physical infrastructure. "He's not projecting growth," Caleb said, looking at the figures spread across the conference table. "He's claiming volume that doesn't exist yet as if it already does, which would make the investment appear significantly safer than it is," Sloane said. "And if someone signed off on these figures as verified," Caleb said slowly, "they'd be carrying the liability if the investment collapsed." He stopped. He looked at the signature line on the bottom of one of the verification documents. His name wasn't there, but the employee ID number, the one he'd used for every system login at Hartwell for 11 years, was. He set the page down. He said nothing for a moment. "Someone used your credentials," Sloane said. She had already seen it. "Someone had access to the internal system," Caleb said, "which means someone with a relationship to Hartwell's internal operations gave it to them." He thought of the man in the gray suit, the one Preston had spoken to at the wedding both times the conversation needed privacy. "Who is Garrick Stone?" Sloane looked up. "Preston's financial advisor." "Why?" "Because during the reception, every time Preston needed to step away from a conversation that was getting complicated, he went to Garrick Stone. Not to a lawyer, not to a business partner, to his financial advisor." Caleb looked at her. "What does a financial advisor need to discuss that urgently at a wedding?" Sloane was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she picked up her phone. What followed were 2 weeks that Caleb would later describe to no one because there was no version of the story that didn't sound improbable. Sloane's legal team moved quietly. They requested internal audit records from 3 warehouse facilities in the Southern Corridor, cross-referenced employee access logs, and traced the origin of the credential misuse to a third-party administrative account linked to Garrick Stone's consulting firm. The picture that emerged was methodical and deliberate. Stone had been running a documentation scheme across several of Preston's business ventures, creating the appearance of operational scale that didn't exist and using borrowed credentials to give the falsified records a veneer of legitimacy. Caleb cooperated with every request. He provided records, answered questions, walked the legal team through the operational logic. He did it on his own time, outside of work hours, without asking for anything in return. He did it because his name was on a document he had never signed, and because the alternative was letting that stand. It was during the second week that Talia called. He let it ring twice before answering. She sounded different on the phone, flatter, less composed. She said she had received a call from someone asking questions about Preston's business filings. She said she didn't understand what was happening. She said she thought Caleb was behind it. "I'm not behind anything," he said. "I'm in front of something. There's a difference. You're doing this to hurt me." "Talia," he kept his voice even. "Have I ever done anything just to hurt you?" Silence. "There are documents with my credentials on them that I didn't authorize," he said. "I'm not going to let that stand. If Preston is connected to what happened, that's not something I created. It's something I found." He said, "You've always been jealous." I know what he said. Caleb exhaled slowly. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as someone who has no reason left to lie to you. Some of the paperwork you signed for Preston during the engagement period may be connected to this. You need to talk to an independent attorney before you say another word to anyone else." Another silence. Longer. "Why would you tell me that?" she asked. "After everything." "Because whatever happened between us has nothing to do with whether you deserve to know you're at risk," he said. "Those are two different things." He heard her breath change on the other end of the line. He didn't wait for her to respond. "Get a lawyer, Talia," he said. "Do it tomorrow." He hung up. The collapse came faster than Caleb expected because Sloane moved faster than Preston had anticipated. Preston had assumed, apparently, that Sloane's public appearance with Caleb at the wedding was sentimental, a momentary lapse in professional judgment by a woman who had let herself be charmed by a compelling story. He had believed that the reputational pressure he had begun applying, the quiet circulation of photographs, the whispered narrative of the grieving ex-husband who had found a vulnerable CEO would be enough to slow her down. He had misread Sloane Fairchild in a fundamental way. She had already moved. By the time the photograph surfaced in a local business blog with a narrative about romantic entanglement clouding investment decisions, Sloane's legal team had already filed for an independent audit of all 3 relevant warehouse accounts. By the time Preston's associates began calling members of the Fairchild board with concerns about Sloane's judgment, the audit had already confirmed the credential irregularities. But the photographs still ran. The blog post still circulated. And 2 days later, Caleb was called into his supervisor's office at Hartwell and placed on administrative suspension pending an internal review of the flagged documents bearing his employee ID. He sat in the parking lot afterward for 20 minutes. 11 years. Every night shift, every manifest, every time he had flagged something that was easier to ignore because it was the right thing to do. Reduced to a suspension notice in an envelope with his name typed on the front. He drove home. He sat at his kitchen table. He opened the folder he had brought home from Sloane's office, his own records, his own documentation, years of it, and he looked at it for a long time. Then he called his daughter. Maya answered on the second ring, her voice easy and warm the way it always was, and he told her nothing was wrong. Just wanted to hear her voice. How was school? She talked for 40 minutes about a research project and a professor she admired, and a coffee shop near campus that had become her favorite place to study. He listened to every word. When he hung up, he felt something settle back into its correct position inside him. He picked up the folder. He opened his laptop, and he started putting together the clearest, most documented account he could construct of everything he knew, everything he had seen, and everything that had been done in his name without his consent. If they were going to use his name, they were going to do it in a room where he was also present. The morning of the board meeting, Caleb woke at 4:30. Not because his alarm went off, he had set it for 6, but because his body had spent 11 years calibrating itself to the night shift, and 4:30 was when the mind starts running the checklist whether you want it to or not. He lay in the dark for a few minutes looking at the ceiling and thought about what he was walking into. He had been in difficult rooms before, rooms where the outcome was already decided and his job was to stand in them anyway and say the true thing. He had done it when he flagged the manifest discrepancy during Sloane's audit, knowing his supervisor had already been told to let it pass. He had done it when he testified in a workers' comp dispute 2 years ago on behalf of a floor crew member whose injury had been misdocumented. He had never won anything from those rooms immediately, but he had never walked out of them having said something false. Today would be the same. He would say the true thing. Whatever happened after that was out of his hands. He got up, made coffee, and ironed his shirt. Sloane had not slept. She had been awake since 2, working through the presentation her legal team had prepared, reading it the way she read everything, not for what it said, but for what it assumed. She was looking for the places where confidence had substituted for certainty, where a reasonable interpretation had been dressed up as a conclusion. She found 3. She sent corrections at 3:15. By 4, she had a revised version that said only what could be proven and nothing that couldn't. That was the version she brought to the boardroom. The Fairchild board met in a glass-walled room on the 14th floor of the company's Atlanta headquarters. 8 members. 4 of them had called her personally in the past week with some variation of the same concern that her judgment had been compromised, that the situation with Caleb was a liability, that the cleanest resolution was to distance the company from the entire matter and let the legal process work itself out without Fairchild's active involvement. She had listened to each of them fully. She had said she understood their concern. She had not agreed. Caleb arrived at 8:50, 10 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. He wore the same suit he had worn to the wedding, freshly dry-cleaned, this time not by his own hand. Sloane met him in the hallway outside the boardroom. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the dance floor, directly, without performance. "How are you?" she asked. "Ready," he said. "You?" "The same," she paused. "I want you to know that whatever happens in that room, the audit findings stand independent of anything else. Your name gets cleared regardless of how the board responds to my recommendations." Caleb looked at her. "Is that your way of telling me not to worry about you?" "It's my way of telling you the facts." "The facts," he said, "include the fact that you put your position at risk to pursue this. I'm not going to pretend I don't know that." Sloane held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a door opens when someone finally uses the right key. "Let's go in," she said. Preston was already seated when they entered. He had been invited to respond to the audit findings, which was standard procedure, and which he had clearly used to prepare. He had 2 attorneys with him and a counter-presentation printed on heavy stock paper and distributed to each board member before the meeting began. He looked as he always looked, like a man who believed that confidence was the same thing as correctness. Garrick Stone was not present. He had retained separate counsel the previous afternoon. The board chair opened the meeting with a summary of the situation: the independent audit, the credential irregularities, the discrepancy between projected and documentable operational volume. She was precise and neutral in her language, the way a person is when they are determined not to be accused of having taken a side before the evidence has been presented. Preston's attorneys went first. They were good, Caleb had expected them to be. They argued that the credential irregularities were the result of a system vulnerability at Hartwell, not deliberate misappropriation. They suggested that Caleb, as the employee whose ID had been used, might have shared access inadvertently or deliberately, that his involvement with Sloane represented a conflict of interest that should raise questions about the audit's independence. They were careful. They didn't accuse directly. They simply arranged the available facts to suggest a shape that served their client. Caleb listened without expression. When they finished, Sloane presented the audit findings. She did it the way she had prepared, without interpretation, without drama. She let the numbers describe themselves. The projected volume that exceeded documented capacity by 300%. The access log timestamps that placed the credential use on dates when Caleb had been verified off-system. The trail of the third-party administrative account linked to Stone's consulting firm. She put each fact on the table like a tile in a floor, and by the time she finished, the floor was visible. Then the board chair looked at Caleb. "Mr. Reddick," she said, "you've provided documentation to the legal team. Is there anything you'd like to add for the record?" Caleb stood. He had thought about this moment for 3 days. He had considered the ways he could approach it. The version where he was measured and deferential. The version where he was precise and technical. The version where he said as little as possible and let the documents speak. He had rejected all of them because they were versions of the same habit he had carried for 11 years, making himself small enough that the room felt comfortable. He was done with that. "I've worked in logistics operations for 11 years, he said. "Not in a corner office. On the floor. I know what a functional Southern Corridor facility looks like at full capacity because I ran one for 4 years, and I ran it honestly, and the numbers I produced were the numbers that actually existed." He looked at each board member in turn, not aggressive, not pleading, just present. "My employee credentials were used to sign off on documentation that describes a version of those facilities that doesn't exist. I did not authorize that use. I was not asked. And I want to be direct with this board. The reason my name was attached to those records was not a system error. It was a choice. Someone chose my name because I was the person least likely to have the resources to defend myself against the accusation." The room was quiet. "I'm not here asking for sympathy," Caleb continued. "I'm here because I have a right to be in the room where my name is being discussed, and because the truth about what those facilities can and cannot produce is something I can speak to better than anyone else in this building. Ask me anything about those numbers. I'll tell you exactly what's real." 3 of the board members looked at Preston. Preston's lead attorney leaned over and said something in his ear. Preston nodded, once his expression carefully neutral. But his hands resting on the table in front of him had gone very still. What followed was 90 minutes of questions. The board asked Caleb about throughput rates, staffing requirements, dock capacity, seasonal volume patterns, and regulatory compliance timelines. He answered every question without notes from memory because these were not abstractions to him. They were the texture of 11 years of nights spent making sure things that were supposed to move actually moved. At one point, Preston's attorney interjected with a challenge about a specific projection figure, and Caleb walked to the whiteboard and drew the facility layout from memory, labeled each dock door, and explained mathematically why the projected figure was physically impossible given the documented infrastructure. No one interrupted him while he was at the whiteboard. When he sat back down, one of the board members, a woman in her 60s who had not spoken yet, said quietly, "Why didn't you come forward sooner, when you first noticed the discrepancy in the audit?" Caleb looked at her. "Because I flagged it internally and was told it wasn't my concern," he said. "When the person with the authority to act tells you to let something go, you have to decide whether the cost of pushing is worth it. I made the wrong call at the time. I thought I was protecting my job. I was actually protecting the problem." The woman nodded slowly. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said in this room today," she said. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. Caleb sat in a waiting area on the same floor, a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside him. Sloane sat across from him, not speaking, reviewing something on her phone with the focused attention of someone who had trained herself not to spend energy on outcomes she couldn't control. After 20 minutes of silence, Caleb said, "I want to ask you something." She looked up. "At the wedding," he said, "before you sat down, how long had you been watching?" Sloane considered the question. "Long enough," she said. "Long enough to decide, or long enough to wait for the right moment?" A pause. "Both." Caleb looked at his coffee. "I've been trying to figure out what made you do it. I understand the business reason now, but that wasn't the only reason." Sloane set her phone down. She looked at him the way she had looked at him when he was at the whiteboard, with the specific attention of someone who respects what they're looking at. "Preston spoke about you like you were furniture," she said. "Like you were a prop in someone else's story. I've been spoken about that way before, by different people in different rooms for different reasons. She paused. I don't enjoy watching it happen to other people.
Caleb looked at her for a long moment.
You could have just left. So could you, she said. He almost smiled. Fair point. The board chair opened the door at 11:47. She didn't announce the outcome in the hallway. She asked them both to come back to the room, which Caleb had learned years ago was a better sign than being kept waiting. Inside, the board was seated. Preston's attorneys were packing their materials. Preston himself was standing near the window with his back to the room. The board chair sat down and looked at Caleb first. Mr. Reddick, the board accepts the audit findings. The credential irregularities are attributed to unauthorized third-party access, and your record is cleared as of today. Your suspension at Hartwell will be addressed through a formal notice to the facility's HR department within 24 hours. She held his gaze. I want to personally say that your willingness to provide testimony in this context without legal representation and without formal compensation reflects a standard of integrity this board does not take lightly. Caleb nodded once. He did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. The chair turned to Sloan. The board supports the decision to withdraw from the proposed investment pending a full legal review. We also want to note for the record that the conduct of this investigation, the standard of evidence, the precision of the audit reflects sound professional judgment. The board's confidence in your leadership is unchanged. Sloan accepted this with a single nod. She did not look relieved. She looked like someone who had done the work correctly and was simply receiving confirmation of that fact. Preston left without speaking to either of them. Talia came to see Caleb 2 weeks later. She called first, which he had not expected, and asked if she could come to the apartment. He said yes. She arrived at 7 in the evening without Preston and stood in his doorway looking like a person who had spent considerable time preparing to say something and had now arrived at the moment of having to actually say it. He let her in. He made coffee. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and waited. I hired the attorney, she said. Good. He said I'm probably okay. The documents I signed weren't the ones directly tied to the falsified records. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. I didn't know, Caleb. I want you to know that. I believe you, he said. He meant it. I shouldn't have said what I said. After Preston released the photos, when I told the reporter you'd always had trouble accepting the end of our marriage. She looked at the table. That wasn't true, and I said it anyway. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. Same flickering overhead light he had never replaced. Same window above the sink that let in the sound of the street below. He had sat in this room through harder nights than this one. I know why you said it, he said. That doesn't make it okay. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She looked up at him. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was trying not to show more than she intended. He recognized it from 10 years of marriage and 6 years of distance. I'm sorry, she said. I know that's not enough, but I mean it. Caleb looked at her. This woman he had built a life with who had left it, who had come back now not to reclaim anything but to account for herself. He thought about his daughter, who had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness. He thought about the years that had happened in this apartment after Talia left, and how those years had shaped him into someone that the woman sitting across from him would not have recognized, and might not have left if she had known he was coming. I forgive you, he said. Not because you've earned it, because I'm not interested in carrying this anymore. Talia exhaled slowly. I hope you're happy, he said. He said it without cruelty and without warmth, simply as a fact he wished for her from a distance that had become permanent and acceptable. Whatever comes next, I hope it's honest. She nodded. She finished her coffee. She left. Caleb sat at the table for a while after she was gone in the quiet of the apartment, and felt something that had been clenched in him for 6 years slowly, finally let go. He was offered the Regional Operations Director position at Fairchild Logistics 8 weeks later. The offer came through the company's formal HR process, submitted before he had any personal conversation with Sloan about it, because that was how she operated. She did not blur the lines between what was professional and what was personal, and she expected the same from the people she worked with. He reviewed the terms. asked 3 specific questions about reporting structure and audit authority, and accepted. His first act in the new role was to request a full review of internal credential management protocols across all regional facilities. His second was to establish an anonymous reporting channel for floor-level employees to flag operational discrepancies without fear of dismissal. His supervisor, the board member who had called his testimony the most honest thing said in the room, approved both requests within the week. The Fairchild Logistics Community Foundation held its first scholarship benefit in November at a small venue in Midtown Atlanta. No lakeside hotel, no French champagne, no 200-name guest list assembled for business purposes. 60 people, round tables, decent food, and a program that celebrated families who had worked their way through difficult years to send their children somewhere better. Caleb stood on the balcony during the break between speakers, looking out over the city. Atlanta at night was a particular kind of beautiful. Not the curated beauty of the ballroom where he had sat at table 14, but the complicated, lit-up, ongoing beauty of a place that was always in the middle of becoming something. He heard footsteps behind him and knew without turning who it was. Sloane stood beside him at the railing. She had a glass of sparkling water. She looked out at the city for a moment in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill every pause. "Good event," he said. "It is." She paused. "You wrote the remarks for the opening speaker." It wasn't a question. She asked for help. "They were good. She's a good speaker. She just needed someone to tell her to stop apologizing for taking up space." Sloane looked at him. In the light from the city below, her expression was open in a way he had only seen a few times, the way it had been at the end of the dance at the wedding when she looked at him and understood something she hadn't known she was looking for. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can. At the wedding, when I sat down and told you to pretend I was your wife." She looked back at the city. "What made you say yes?" Caleb thought about it the way he always thought about things, fully, without rushing. He thought about the ironed suit and the last table and the 11 years and the folder of records and Maya's voice on the phone and the moment in the boardroom when he stood up and decided for the last time that he was done shrinking himself to fit other people's expectations. "Because you asked me," he said. "Not as a favor, not out of pity. You asked me like I was someone worth asking." Sloane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are." He looked at her. The city moved and hummed below them, indifferent and alive. "I know that now," he said. He reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. They stood there together in the November air above the city in the particular peace of 2 people who had arrived at something real by a route neither of them had planned. There was no audience, no performance, no pretending. Just this. Some men are invisible not because they lack worth, but because the world has not yet looked in the right direction. Caleb never needed to be rescued. He needed one person willing to stand beside him long enough for the truth to become visible. And when it did, he had been standing tall the whole time. He had just been standing at the last table. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or written off by someone who didn't take the time to look closer, then you already know what Caleb knows. Quiet dignity is its own kind of strength, and the right people will find you if you refuse to disappear. Stories like this one exist to remind us what we're worth. If that matters to you, subscribe to the channel so the next story finds you too.